for the, I'll go through it quickly. This talk is going to be about mindfulness and competition. And for a brief outline, I'll give an introduction to myself, who I am and what my background is. I'll talk a little bit about the benefits of competition, how we live in a competitive culture, and that does have its benefits. And then I'll move into the downsides of competition. What are the downsides and how they are real and should be recognized? And particularly from a mindful perspective. And I'll talk a little bit about what Thich Nhat Hanh says about competition. He has some very interesting things to say. Alternatives to competition come out of a mindful consideration of competition. And again, we're going to talk about the benefits, but through a mindful consideration of competition, we do also want to take a look, I believe, at some of the alternatives as mindful people. As an introduction, my name is Don Thompson, and I'm an MMTCP graduate of 2023. I'm also an essayist and film producer, mostly of socially relevant films, a lot of documentaries related to subjects that you might say are socially relevant or have a social impact. I've also worked in Wall Street, which may seem a little bit contradictory to what I just said, but life is full of contradictions. I guess I do have a sort of a contradictory streak in me that way. Wall Street was very competitive, and I was helping companies to implement technology right down there, the big ones, the big companies, Goldman Sachs and company, right down there. And I learned a lot about competition by working with those companies and a lot about what those competitive mindsets can look like. And also, more recently, I've been involved with the Center for Mindful Business with Heather and company, which has prompted me to rethink competition and to think about this talk and the desire to give it to you and others. This particular cartoon, I think, is a rather humorous rendition of you might say, an American attitude towards competition, comparing one's attitude or one's self to another in a competitive way, comparing the Zen garden in this case. We have our beer drinking American with a golf club. I think that's probably, I've certainly enjoyed golf once in a while myself, I have to say. Now, to talk a little bit about some of the benefits of competition, I have to say that this, in terms of my thought process surrounding this topic, it's been, you might say, a work in progress. So I've actually recently been looking at some of the literature, particularly within sports and mindfulness within sports. And there actually was, there's been a lot of activity in terms of looking at the, particularly people like George Mumford, who worked with the Chicago Bulls and Phil Jackson for many years, in terms of bringing, mindfulness to the team and to particularly to work through some issues that they had related to stress and trying to come to, what you might say is peak performance. And that really gets into the first item in our list here, which is excellence. So competition can ideally promote excellence by having different mindsets, by having different people, by having different products competing. And so we take a look and compare them, and hopefully the most excellent one will prevail in the market or in the mind share of people or whatever that competitive space happens to be. Almost conversely to that, item 2, low prices can also come out of competition. We all know about Walmart and Costco. So it's not always that excellence prevails. Sometimes people are looking for a bargain. They're looking for low prices. They're looking for, they'll even accept something that's a little bit more mediocre, you might say, as long as it's priced better. And so competition can bring out that as well. The attitude of competing through low prices. Now, low prices, I guess, could become a metaphor for differentiation or a way to differentiate and maybe, accepting lower standards, perhaps. But maybe not. Maybe you're trying to make the best product possible with a low price. So you could do it that way as well. Self-improvement will come out of competition, ideally. Again, if you're looking at yourself and you're looking at your own persona, your own skill set or whatever, and you might seek to improve that in order to be more competitive with others. Particularly within the job market, of course, that takes place quite a bit. People need to, really bring their skill set to a level that's going to be competitive. I know in the tech sector, when I was out there, it was very competitive in terms of skills. You really have to have the right skill set in order to be competitive. Another thing that can come out of competition is a greater variety. I listened to an incredibly interesting talk yesterday, by the way, through the MMTCP Alumni Association, given by a woman who runs an advertising, or has ran, she's been a creative director in New York in advertising, and she was talking all about branding. So one of the benefits of competition is it does provoke us to look at our own personal brand. And you might say that's tied to self-improvement somewhat, but it's really looking at your own brand. What niche are you going into related to mindfulness? You could say that the Center for Mindful Business is, in a sense, a niche. We're looking at the business arena as a niche to bring mindfulness to. But there are other areas, of course, and I mentioned, George Mumford with the Chicago Bulls, almost 20 years ago now, really bringing mindfulness to that team from a sports performance perspective. And then, of course, there's wellness, and there's the big area within MMTCP, within Jack and Tara's world is trauma, is bringing mindfulness to trauma, really to help heal trauma. Mindfulness can also bring out more innovation. It can bring out more innovation because, again, people are competing, products are competing, and you have to differentiate yourself, you have to differentiate your product, and you have to innovate. Best practices can also come out of competition. Again, when I was in the tech sector, we would document, to a great, in great detail what the qualities were of our product when compared to other products in the marketplace, other similar products. So best practices is a way to gauge how you compare to others in the marketplace. It also gives you sort of a template for improvement. You see what you need to work toward in terms of your competitive situation, vis-a-vis the market or vis-a-vis whatever arena you happen to be competing in. As I think competition is within the mindfulness area, particularly within MMTCP, as we were presented it within our cohorts. Competition is not really talked about. That's really one of the reasons why I wanted to bring it up. I wanted to bring it up almost as a Jungian exercise. Jung, the idea with Carl Jung, and looking at the subconscious, looking what's underneath and bringing it up to the surface and just looking at it. You don't necessarily need to judge it. You don't necessarily need to think poorly of it, but you can look at it, and as such, you can become more aware. So the whole intent behind this talk is really towards self-awareness. I think if we're more aware of these things, we can become better teachers. We don't necessarily have to, beat people over the head with it, but I think we can become better teachers if we're more aware of perhaps competitive tendencies within ourselves. Let's talk a little bit about the downsides of competition. And, I mentioned Thich Nhat Hanh before, and right off the bat, what Thich Nhat Hanh talks about in his discussion about mindfulness, he's got a wonderful talk. He gave it during the 2012 Olympics, I think to an Australian broadcaster. And first thing he says, the problem with competition, there's a winner and there's a loser. And the loser is going to suffer and the winner is going to be happy. Go right back to George Mumford and the Chicago Bulls, say what you will, he's a wonderful writer. I've been listening to the audiobook for the Mindful Athlete. It's a beautiful thing, but, sort of unstated, the unstated reality, there's a winner, there's a loser. The Chicago Bulls are going to be the winner, hopefully, they hope, and there's going to be a loser, and the loser is unhappy, whether they're the audience member, looking at the competitive sport, or the team itself. But that's true in any competitive situation. If you don't win out, if you don't get the job, if you don't get the contract, if you're not getting the mind share that you want to, or you're not being as successful as a mindfulness teacher out there as you feel you should be, you can feel like you're a loser. And this is, again, sort of that implicit sense of competition that's really endemic in our society. So competition can cause a lack of empathy because you're looking at, I'm competing with somebody else. You have a lack of empathy for that other person. You're dehumanizing them in a sense. You're othering them. You're making them an other. You're not looking at them as, in a sense, with a sense of interbeing, as what Thich Nhat Hanh would say, interbeing, a connectedness to the individual, to other people, to humanity. You're not looking at it that way from a competitive standpoint. Also within the economic sphere, disparity can arise. Again, winners and losers. The winners are going to be the sliver at the top, the 1%, you might say, in an extreme sense. The 99% of the rest of humanity is middle class or lower class or at the very, very bottom. And you see this kind of economic disparity rise out of competition. And it's really accepted by the top tier as the way things are, the way things should be in a competitive environment. The people at the bottom, well, if they just worked harder, if they did better, if they tried to improve themselves, they can move up. They can be more competitive. Also arising out of this are people that are going to disagree with that assessment. They're going to want to help those people that are at the bottom. They're the nonprofits that form as a reaction to that. They're the for-benefit corporations that form as a response to that disparity, wherever that disparity lies. I just saw an amazing documentary. It's just incredible where the mineral cobalt is mined in Africa, and they have little children, little teeny ones mining this cobalt. It all goes into our cell phones, or lithium. And so these minerals that are mined in Africa, in the Congo, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, all of us are carrying their cell phones. They all are being mined by these little kids. If we're not mindful about the results of competition to those kinds of people, it's really, it's a lot of dehumanization takes place as a result. Aloneness can also arise from competition. When I was a kid, I used to go out by myself alone and sit on the jungle gym because I didn't want to compete with the kids in Foursquare, particularly in the 6th and 7th grade. I had friends in my neighborhood, and fortunately I could go back and play with them. But I would sit off alone. I didn't really want to compete. I was too sensitive as a child. I found other ways to compete later, in the arts or technology or whatever. But a lot of aloneness can come out of competition because people that don't want to compete separate themselves. So there's a separation that can happen through competition, which is not really healthy for society. I'd like to talk now a little bit about some of the alternatives to competition. And a lot of these words, as mindful people, we're aware of, we understand, we're familiar with, but I'll just go over them briefly here. These are really, these are ways that we want to improve from a mindful consideration of competition as alternatives to a competitive mindset. Cooperation, for benefit, holistic view, and compassion. By cooperation, we begin to understand that cooperating with other people is really a very effective way to get things done. Within corporations, major corporations, there's going to be a lot of cooperation within their teams. Like there's a lot of cooperation within the teams, George Mumford was prompting the cooperation among the teams within the Chicago Bulls. He was saying they need to cooperate, and they need to become of one mind, was his way to put it. So there's a sense of cooperation within a particular entity, like a company or a team, but my sense is that we can expand that sense of cooperation. That need for cooperation can extend out. For benefit really has to do with looking at how you can benefit others and having more of a service attitude. So ultimately, the Center for Mindful Business is set up as a for-benefit corporation. What that means, it actually is a moniker that you can assign to a corporation. You can actually incorporate as a for-benefit corporation. And it's a different stance. It takes a look at the Profit motive is the sole reasoning behind setting up a company and tries to expand it out to a more holistic view, which is our next point, the holistic view of what's called within the Center for Mindful Business, the triple bottom line: people, planet, and profit. So profit becomes, not the only way to look at the rationale for your business. You look at the people, the wellness of the people. You take a look at the environment and the wellness of the environment. The profit should not happen at the expense of these other things. It should not happen at the expense of them, so that you end up with situations like the kids in the mines in Africa. That's not a good thing. We should look at that and deal with it, and just because we're here in the United States doesn't give us an excuse, I don't think. Compassion comes in terms of working for the greater good. And really, you change your stance. You change the motivation for action becomes one of compassion, as opposed to a motivation of competition. Again, a lot of this is, I think, implicit. And I think when I hear people in groups for mindfulness teaching, I get a sense of this almost intuitively, that there's an underlying sense of competitiveness. Maybe it's just me projecting my own competitiveness into the situation. But that said, I think a lot of people have developed very altruistic motivations for mindfulness and for why they want to do mindfulness teaching. And I think that's a really wonderful thing. And compassion is, of course, what the Buddha is teaching us in terms of mindfulness. And our rationale, our reason, our motivation, our intent is to be compassionate. So that's pretty much my talk for mindfulness and competition. Thank you so much for listening. I appreciate it. And now we can, if you have any questions, feel free. This is a work in progress. I always really enjoy the feedback and any questions you have.